My husband stood in his corner office overlooking Manhattan and told me I would be nothing without his last name. That every door I had ever walked through opened only because of him. 3 years later, I stood in my own headquarters watching my company's valuation hit $200 million, while his empire crumbled under investigation. But this story does not begin with triumph. It begins on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when I still believed that love and partnership meant something. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm sounded at 5:30 in the morning, the same time it had sounded every weekday for the past 6 years of my marriage to Alexander Ashford Chan. I reached across the California king bed to silence it before the noise could disturb him, my hand moving through the practiced motion that had become as automatic as breathing. The sheets on his side remained cool and undisturbed. He had not come to bed again, which meant he had fallen asleep in his study after working late into the night, or perhaps he had never come home at all from whatever dinner meeting or networking event had filled his evening calendar. I rose quietly and moved through the morning routine that had been carefully constructed to support the demanding schedule of a tech industry titan. The bathroom was larger than my childhood bedroom had been. All marble surfaces and chrome fixtures that gleamed under perfectly calibrated lighting. I showered quickly, dried my hair, and applied makeup with efficient precision. The walk-in closet contained rows of designer clothing selected by a personal stylist who understood what was appropriate for the wife of someone like Alexander. I chose a cream silk blouse and tailored navy trousers, paired with understated jewelry that whispered wealth without shouting it. By 6:15 I was downstairs in the kitchen of our Tribeca penthouse, preparing the breakfast that Alexander preferred when he bothered to eat it. Fresh pressed juice, egg white omelet with vegetables, whole grain toast, black coffee. The housekeeper would not arrive until 8, which meant this task fell to me on the mornings when I woke before the staff. I had grown up cooking for my younger siblings while my mother worked double shifts at the hospital, so the muscle memory of feeding others remained deeply ingrained despite years of having staff to handle such necessities. I found Alexander exactly where I expected him, slumped over his desk in the study with his computer still glowing and papers scattered across every surface. He had not changed out of yesterday's custom suit, though he had at least removed his tie at some point during the night. I set the breakfast tray on the credenza and gently touched his shoulder. He jerked awake with the startled aggression of someone whose nervous system remained perpetually prepared for corporate warfare. His eyes took a moment to focus, moving from confusion to recognition to something that might have been irritation at being disturbed. He was 42 years old, 9 years my senior, with the kind of striking features that photographs loved and the commanding presence that made people instinctively defer to him in any room he entered. "You fell asleep at your desk again," I said quietly, keeping my voice neutral and non-judgmental. "I brought you breakfast." He glanced at his watch, a limited edition timepiece that cost more than most people earned in a year, and swore under his breath. "I have a board meeting at 8. Why did you let me sleep so long?" The accusation landed with the casual cruelty of someone who had long ago stopped monitoring the impact of his words on those around him. I had not been in the study when he fell asleep. I had no way of knowing when he had come home or whether he had come home at all. But these logical observations would only provoke an argument that I had no energy to navigate before sunrise, so I simply said, "You have time to shower and change. I will have your car brought around." He stood and moved past me without acknowledgement, already scrolling through his phone and muttering about messages he needed to return. I remained in the study, gathering the scattered papers and organizing them into neat stacks, closing the laptop, disposing of the empty coffee cups that had accumulated like archaeological evidence of his nocturnal work session. This too had become part of my routine, the invisible labor of maintaining the environment that allowed Alexander to focus entirely on building his empire. Chun Technologies had been Alexander's singular focus for the past 15 years, growing from a startup founded in his college dorm room to a major player in enterprise software solutions with offices in 12 countries and a valuation that fluctuated somewhere north of $3 billion depending on market conditions. He had built something genuinely impressive through a combination of technical brilliance, strategic ruthlessness, and the kind of tireless work ethic that consumed everything in its path, including marriages and personal relationships. I had met Alexander 7 years ago at a charity fundraiser where I had been working as an event coordinator for the nonprofit that organized the evening. He had been the keynote speaker, delivering a presentation about leveraging technology for social impact that had been both intellectually compelling and surprisingly personal. After his speech, he had sought me out specifically to compliment the event organization and to ask questions about the nonprofit's operational model that demonstrated he had actually been paying attention rather than simply fulfilling an obligation to appear. We had talked for 2 hours that night, long after the other guests had departed and the venue staff had begun breaking down tables. He had been charming and interested, asking about my work and my aspirations with what seemed like genuine curiosity. When he asked for my number, I had hesitated, aware of the vast gulf between his world and mine, but he had been persistent in a way that felt flattering rather than aggressive. He pursued me with the same focused intensity that he brought to business challenges, and I had been 26 years old and naive enough to mistake that intensity for devotion. The courtship had been intoxicating. He took me to restaurants I had only read about, introduced me to artists and entrepreneurs and thought leaders, traveled with me to cities I had only dreamed of visiting. He made me feel intelligent and interesting, asking my opinions on everything from art to politics to the strategic decisions facing his company. He told me I had insights that others missed, that my perspective from outside the tech industry bubble helped him see things more clearly. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, presenting a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and speaking about partnership and building a life together, I believed I had found someone who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The wedding had been a massive affair, covered by business publications and society pages, attended by venture capitalists and politicians and celebrities. My family had been overwhelmed by the scale and expense of it all, my mother crying throughout the ceremony from a complicated mixture of joy and discomfort at being so far outside her familiar world. Alexander's parents, old money from Hong Kong who had relocated to San Francisco decades earlier, had been politely distant, making clear through subtle gestures that they viewed me as an acceptable choice but certainly not the match they would have selected for their brilliant son. The first year of marriage had been challenging but navigable. Alexander worked constantly, but I had understood that building a company required sacrifice. I had left my job at the nonprofit at his suggestion, with him arguing that my skills could be better utilized supporting his work, and that the compensation package and benefits he provided made my modest salary irrelevant. It had made logical sense at the time, and I had thrown myself into the role of supporting spouse, managing our household, organizing the social obligations that came with his position, and serving as a sounding board for his business concerns. By the second year, the foundation had begun showing cracks. Alexander became increasingly dismissive of my opinions, particularly when they diverged from his own. The questions about my perspective stopped coming. The conversations about partnership gave way to monologues about his challenges and frustrations, with my role reduced to sympathetic listening and agreement. When I attempted to discuss returning to work or pursuing further education, he responded with confusion about why I would want to do either when everything I needed was provided, and my primary responsibility was supporting his demanding schedule. The third year brought escalation. Alexander's work hours expanded to consume nearly every waking moment. His temper, previously reserved for incompetent employees or underperforming business units, began manifesting at home over minor domestic issues. He criticized my management of household staff, my social skills at company events, my appearance, my failure to understand the pressures he faced. When I suggested marriage counseling, he laughed and said the problem was not the marriage but my inability to appreciate what I had been given. By the fourth year, I had learned to make myself small and unobtrusive, to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, to avoid any topic that might trigger his irritation. I managed the penthouse like a 5-star hotel, ensuring everything functioned seamlessly without requiring his attention. I accompanied him to events when he wanted a spouse present and made myself scarce when he did not. I maintained my appearance and my social skills and my supportive demeanor while feeling increasingly hollow inside, aware that I had become an accessory to his life, rather than a partner in it. The fifth year brought a different kind of pain. I had begun noticing that Alexander rarely touched me anymore, unless initiating perfunctory sex that felt more like stress relief than intimacy. He took phone calls during dinners and checked email during conversations. He scheduled business trips without informing me and returned from them without curiosity about what I had done in his absence. I existed in his peripheral vision, visible when needed but fundamentally unimportant to his primary concerns. Now, in the 6th year of our marriage, I had become a ghost haunting my own life. I organized and managed and supported while feeling nothing except a dull awareness that this could not be what love was supposed to feel like. I told myself that all marriages went through difficult phases, that building a company required sacrifices, that my comfortable life was something many people would envy. I volunteered at local nonprofits to fill my time and give myself a sense of purpose beyond household management. I maintained friendships, though increasingly I found myself unable to be honest with friends about the reality of my marriage, instead performing the role of contented wife while dying quietly inside. This particular Tuesday morning continued its ordinary progression. Alexander emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, showered and dressed in a fresh suit, scrolling through his phone as he descended the stairs. He grabbed the coffee I had poured for him without acknowledgement and headed for the door. "There is a dinner tonight with the venture capital team," he said without looking up from his screen. "We need to discuss the Series D funding round. Be ready by 7. "Will this be at the usual restaurant?" I asked, mentally calculating what I needed to arrange for the afternoon. "No, at the Union Square location. We're something impressive but not distracting. These investors are conservative." He paused at the door and finally looked at me directly for the first time that morning. "And Victoria, please do not dominate the conversation with your nonprofit stories. These people do not care about social impact initiatives. They care about returns and market position." My name is Victoria Chun. Though I had been Victoria Martinez before marriage erased my family name in favor of his. I had been raised in Queens by a single mother who worked as a nurse, the oldest of 3 children who had learned early that my role was to help raise my siblings while my mother kept us fed and housed. I had put myself through college while working full-time, graduating with a degree in nonprofit management and idealistic plans to make the world better. I had believed that intelligence and hard work and good intentions were sufficient to build a meaningful life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standing in my luxurious penthouse kitchen, wearing clothes that cost more than my mother's monthly rent, married to a billionaire who spoke to me like a subordinate employee, I felt the full weight of how thoroughly I had betrayed every principle that younger version of myself had held. I had traded my independence and identity for financial security and social status, and the price had been higher than I could have imagined when I signed the marriage certificate. "I understand," I said to Alexander's retreating back. "I will be ready." The door closed behind him, and silence filled the penthouse like water flooding a compartment. I stood motionless for several minutes, coffee cup in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Something was shifting inside me, some tectonic plate of the self that had been grinding against another plate for years, building pressure that would eventually have to release. I did not yet understand what that release would look like, but I could feel it coming the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground begins to move. I spent the morning managing household affairs, coordinating with staff, responding to emails about charity events I was expected to attend, and organizing Alexander's schedule in ways his executive assistant had not managed. His assistant, Melissa, had been with the company for 8 years and ran his professional life with terrifying efficiency, but certain personal obligations still fell to me. I confirmed dinner reservations, ensured his dry cleaning would be delivered, and arranged for a gift to be sent to a business associate's wife who had recently given birth. In the early afternoon, I met my friend Jasmine for lunch at a cafe in the West Village. Jasmine and I had met in college, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared frustration with professors who underestimated female students. She had gone on to law school and now worked as a corporate attorney at a major firm, representing the same kinds of companies that Alexander ran. She was one of the few people in my life who had known me before marriage, who remembered Victoria Martinez and occasionally asked what had happened to her. "You look tired," Jasmine said after we had ordered, her dark eyes assessing me with the sharp attention she brought to everything. "Is Alexander still working those insane hours? When is he not?" I attempted a light tone that fooled neither of us. "He is closing a major funding round. Everything else is secondary." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, coffee cup cradled in both hands. "Can I ask you something? And will you promise to give me an honest answer instead of the polished response you give everyone else?" My heart rate accelerated slightly, the way it did whenever someone threatened to pierce the careful performance I maintained. "That depends on the question. Are you happy?" The question hung between us, three simple words that felt impossibly complicated to answer. I opened my mouth to deliver the expected response about how fortunate I was, how much I had, how many people would love to have my problems. But something in Jasmine's expression stopped me, some combination of concern and patience that suggested she was prepared to wait through however many deflections I offered until I told her the truth. "No," I said finally, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "No, I am not happy. I have not been happy for a long time." Jasmine nodded slowly, unsurprised. "What are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? I have no income, no recent work experience, no independent resources. Everything I have is connected to Alexander and his name. I would be starting from nothing." "You would be starting from yourself," Jasmine corrected. "Which is not nothing. Victoria, you are one of the smartest and most capable people I know. You managed complex events and programs before you got married. You have skills and intelligence and drive. The fact that you have not been using those things does not mean they disappeared." "It has been 6 years," I protested. "The nonprofit world has changed. Technology has changed. I am out of touch with everything." "Then get back in touch," Jasmine said with a direct practicality that made her an effective attorney. "Take classes, make connections, rebuild your skills. Or do something completely different. The point is that you have agency here, even if it does not feel like it." Our food arrived, providing a natural break in the conversation, but Jasmine's words continued echoing in my mind throughout the meal. Agency. The concept felt foreign after years of constructing my life around someone else's needs and schedule. What would it even look like to exercise agency, to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what supported Alexander's empire? After lunch, I returned to the penthouse and spent the afternoon preparing for the dinner that evening. I chose a black dress that Alexander would find appropriately impressive, paired with jewelry that signaled wealth without ostentation. I styled my hair and refreshed my makeup, transforming myself into the polished accessory that would reflect well on my husband, without drawing too much attention. Alexander returned at 6:45, barely leaving enough time to change into evening wear before the car arrived. He was already stressed, snapping at me about the location of cufflinks and complaining about an analyst who had delivered disappointing projections. I handed him the cufflinks, straightened his tie, and followed him to the car without comment. The dinner was held at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant near Union Square, attended by 4 partners from the venture capital firm that was leading Chen Technologies' Series D funding round. Alexander transformed in their presence, becoming charming and confident and persuasive, presenting his vision for the company's expansion with the compelling certainty that had attracted investors throughout his career. I sat beside him, smiling at appropriate moments, making small talk with the partners' spouses, and generally fulfilling my role as supportive wife who added polish to the package without creating distraction. Midway through the main course, one of the partners, a man named Robert Chambers whose firm managed billions in technology investments, turned his attention to me with the polite interest that successful men sometimes directed toward wives at business dinners. "Alexander mentioned you used to work in the nonprofit sector," he said. "What drew you to that field?" It was a courtesy question, the kind of small talk that filled the spaces between substantive business discussion, but I found myself actually considering how to answer honestly rather than deflecting with something bland and forgettable. "I believe that organizations serving communities could benefit from better operational systems and strategic planning," I said. "Most nonprofits are run by people with passion and dedication, but limited resources and business training. I wanted to help bridge that gap." "That sounds like meaningful work," Robert said, and something in his tone suggested the comment was more than mere politeness. "Did you find it effective?" "Sometimes," I replied. "The challenge was that nonprofits often resist business approaches, viewing them as antithetical to their mission. But the most effective organizations I worked with understood that social impact and operational excellence are not mutually exclusive." Alexander's hand found my knee under the table, fingers pressing in what might have looked like affection to observers but which I recognized as a warning. I was talking too much, drawing too much attention, failing to remain appropriately secondary. I smiled and redirected the conversation back to Robert, asking about his firm's investment thesis, and allowing the discussion to return to topics that mattered. The dinner concluded near 11, after dessert and coffee, and the kind of extended conversation that signaled successful relationship building. The investors seemed satisfied, Alexander seemed pleased, and I had fulfilled my function without creating problems. We rode home in silence, Alexander absorbed in his phone, responding to messages that could not wait until morning. Back at the penthouse, I changed out of the black dress and removed my makeup while Alexander disappeared into his study to handle some urgent matter that his CFO had flagged. I lay in bed reading, expecting him to work through the night as usual, but he surprised me by appearing in the bedroom doorway near midnight. "That went well," he said, loosening his tie. Chambers seemed impressed. "His firm will likely lead the round, which gives us leverage with the other investors." "I am glad," I said, and meant it despite everything. I had never wanted Alexander to fail at the work that mattered so much to him. I simply wanted to matter to him as well. He sat on the edge of the bed, back to me, removing his shoes. "You were good tonight. Appropriate. That story about nonprofit management was actually helpful, made me seem more well-rounded than just another tech founder chasing returns." The words should have felt like a compliment, but instead they landed like confirmation of my worst fears. I was useful. I added value to his presentation. I served a function in his portfolio of assets. But I was not seen, not truly known, not valued for anything beyond my contribution to his success. "Alexander," I said slowly, trying to find words for the question that had been building in me for months or perhaps years. "Do you love me?" He paused in the act of removing his other shoe, his back still to me. Several seconds passed before he responded. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one that deserves an honest answer." He stood and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I married you. I provide for you. I have given you everything. What more do you want?" "I want to be seen," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I want to be known. I want to matter to you as a person rather than as a function." Something shifted in his expression, hardening into the look he got when dealing with employees who disappointed him. "You are being emotional and dramatic. I have been under enormous pressure with this funding round. Can we not have this conversation right now?" "When would be a good time?" I asked. "When will you not be under pressure? When will your company not require every ounce of your attention?" "When you understand what is at stake," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I am building something that matters, Victoria. I am creating value in jobs and innovation. What you are asking for is selfish and small." The accusation hit like a physical blow, winding me. Selfish. Small. Wanting to be loved by my husband was selfish and small. Wanting partnership rather than performance was unreasonable. Wanting to matter was asking too much. "I see," I said quietly. "Do you?" He moved toward the door, already dismissing the conversation. "Because honestly, Victoria, sometimes I wonder if you have any idea how fortunate you are. Do you know how many women would love to be in your position? You have no financial concerns, no responsibilities beyond managing a household that mostly runs itself. You wear designer clothes and attend exclusive events. You live in a penthouse in Tribeca. And you are complaining that I do not pay enough attention to you?" He paused in the doorway, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a cold finality that seemed to freeze the air between us. "You would be nothing without my name. Every door you walk through opens because you are my wife. Every person who takes your calls does so because of who I am. Without me, you would still be coordinating charity dinners for nonprofit executives in Queens. So perhaps you should spend less time questioning whether I love you and more time being grateful for what you have been given." He left the room, and I heard his study door close with quiet firmness. I sat motionless in the bed, my book forgotten in my lap, those words echoing in my mind with the destructive force of a detonation. "You would be nothing without my name." Something inside me shattered in that moment, some final illusion that I had been clinging to about what our marriage was or could become. And in the space where that illusion had existed, something else began growing. It felt like anger, or perhaps clarity, Or possibly the first stirrings of the self-respect I had sacrificed on the altar of this relationship. I rose from the bed and moved to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. Lights blazing in buildings where other people were living their lives, making their choices, building their own futures. I thought about Jasmine's question over lunch. Are you happy? And her statement about agency. You have agency here, even if it does not feel like it. Alexander believed I would be nothing without his name. He had built his entire understanding of our relationship on that foundation, viewing me as an extension of himself rather than a person in my own right. And perhaps for the past 6 years, I had accepted that narrative, performing the role he assigned me and telling myself that my own dreams and ambitions were selfish and small compared to his grand vision. But standing in the darkness, looking out at the city, I felt something shifting. I did not yet know what I would do or how I would do it. I did not have a plan or resources or even clarity about what I wanted beyond knowing that I could not continue living like this. But I knew with sudden certainty that Alexander was wrong. I would not be nothing without his name. I would be Victoria Martinez, the girl from Queens who had put herself through college, who had built programs and managed complex organizations, who had intelligence and capability and drive that had been dormant but not destroyed. I would be myself, whoever that was beneath the polish and performance I had been maintaining for 6 years. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I had no idea where to begin or how to proceed. But for the first time in years, I felt something stirring inside me that resembled hope. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city beyond our windows, and began the long process of imagining what it might look like to become the protagonist of my own story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. The morning after Alexander's declaration arrived with the same mechanical precision as every other morning, the alarm sounding at 5:30, my hand reaching automatically to silence it before disrupting the emptiness beside me. He had not come to bed again, which no longer surprised me or caused concern. I rose and moved through the bathroom routine with the muscle memory of repetition, but something fundamental had shifted in the quality of my awareness. I watched myself in the mirror as though observing a stranger, noting the careful makeup application and styled hair with new recognition of how much effort I invested in maintaining an appearance designed to please someone who barely looked at me. The previous night's words continued echoing with the persistence of a song stuck in mental repetition. You would be nothing without my name. The statement had been intended to diminish me, to remind me of my subordinate position in our relationship hierarchy, but instead it had ignited something that felt dangerous and necessary. If Alexander believed I was nothing without him, then the only way to prove otherwise was to become something independent of his influence and resources. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying in ways I was only beginning to understand. I prepared his breakfast as usual, finding him asleep at his desk surrounded by financial projections and market analysis reports. The sight that had once evoked sympathy now generated a different response, something closer to emotional detachment. I set the tray on the credenza without waking him and returned to the kitchen, pouring my own coffee and sitting at the counter in the early morning silence. The penthouse around me represented everything I had gained through marriage and everything I had lost. The art on the walls had been selected by a consultant Alexander hired, reflecting his taste rather than mine. The furniture arranged in aesthetically perfect configurations throughout rooms we rarely used together. The kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances that prepared meals for a husband who ate most dinners at business meetings or working through the night at his desk. I had been living in a museum dedicated to someone else's life, performing the role of curator while my own preferences and desires atrophied from disuse. I thought about my life before Alexander, the cramped apartment in Queens I had shared with 2 roommates, working long hours at the nonprofit while taking evening classes to build skills in program evaluation and strategic planning. The work had been exhausting and often frustrating, dealing with limited budgets and organizational dysfunction, but it had been mine. I had made decisions that mattered, solved problems that affected real communities, collaborated with people who valued my contributions. That version of myself felt impossibly distant now, like remembering someone I had known in childhood rather than a woman I had been just 7 years earlier. My phone vibrated with a text message from Jasmine, asking how the dinner had gone and whether I wanted to meet for coffee later in the week. I stared at the message for several minutes, considering how to respond. The truth was complicated and exposing. The performance was exhausting. I typed and deleted several versions before settling on something non-committal about getting together soon. Knowing that Jasmine would see through the evasion, but hoping she would grant me space to process whatever was happening inside me. Alexander emerged from his study near 7, moving past me toward the bedroom to shower and change for his morning meetings. He did not acknowledge my presence or reference our conversation from the previous night, treating the confrontation as though it had never occurred. This was his standard approach to conflict, simply moving forward and expecting others to adjust to his preferred reality. I had learned over years of marriage that attempting to revisit difficult conversations only resulted in his irritation and my frustration, so I remained silent and allowed him to reset the dynamic without discussion. After he departed for his office, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop and began researching something I had been avoiding for years. I searched for information about nonprofit management trends, examined job postings to understand what skills and qualifications were currently valued, and read articles about career reentry for women who had taken extended breaks from professional work. The information was both encouraging and daunting. The field had evolved significantly during my absence, with new technologies and methodologies that I would need to learn. Many positions required recent experience or specific certifications I did not possess. The path back to professional relevance appeared steep and uncertain, but as I continued reading, I began noticing patterns in the job descriptions and articles. Organizations were seeking people who understood both operational efficiency and mission-driven work, who could bridge the gap between business principles and social impact, who brought strategic thinking to resource-constrained environments. These were exactly the skills I had been developing before marriage, the capabilities I had enjoyed using and wanted to expand. The work still existed and still mattered. I had simply stopped believing that I could contribute to it. I spent the morning creating a document that cataloged my skills, experience, and knowledge gaps. The exercise was humbling, forcing me to acknowledge how much I had allowed my professional capabilities to deteriorate through years of disuse. But it also revealed strengths I had forgotten I possessed. I had managed complex events involving hundreds of attendees and dozens of stakeholders. I had developed program evaluation frameworks that helped organizations measure impact and improve effectiveness. I had written successful grant proposals and built partnerships between nonprofits and corporate sponsors. These accomplishments had not disappeared simply because I stopped referencing them. They remained part of my history and could potentially become foundation for my future. By early afternoon, I had drafted a preliminary plan for rebuilding professional credibility. I would need to update my knowledge of current nonprofit management practices, probably through online courses or certificate programs. I would need to rebuild my network, reconnecting with former colleagues and making new connections in the field. I would need to develop competence with technologies and platforms that had emerged or evolved during my absence. Most challenging, I would need to find a way to re-enter professional work, despite the 6-year gap in my resume that would raise questions from any potential employer. The magnitude of the challenge was overwhelming when I considered it in totality, but I forced myself to focus on immediate next steps rather than the entire journey. I could enroll in an online course this week. I could reach out to one former colleague to reconnect. I could spend an hour each day familiarizing myself with new project management software or data analysis tools. Small actions accumulated over time could eventually reconstruct professional capabilities that would make me employable and independent. But even as I developed this plan, doubt crept in from all directions. Who was I fooling with this fantasy of professional re-entry? I was 33 years old with a 6-year gap in my work history and skills that had degraded through neglect. I had no recent references, no current professional network, no achievements from the past half-decade beyond successfully managing a household and supporting my husband's career. What employer would take a chance on someone with my profile when they could hire younger candidates with current experience and continuous career progression? And beyond the practical barriers, there was the deeper question of whether I even had the courage to pursue this path. Leaving my marriage or building an independent life would mean confronting Alexander's anger and disappointment, navigating divorce proceedings that would likely be contentious and expensive, explaining my decision to his family and our social circle, managing my own family's confusion and concern. It would mean living with less financial security, moving from a penthouse to whatever modest apartment I could afford on an entry-level salary if I even managed to find employment. It would mean trading the comfortable prison of my current life for the uncertain freedom of starting over from nothing. These thoughts circled through my mind throughout the afternoon as I went through the motions of my usual responsibilities. I confirmed appointments for Alexander, coordinated with the housekeeper about the weekend cleaning schedule, and responded to an email from the chair of a nonprofit gala committee asking me to serve on the event planning team. The irony was sharp. I was considered qualified to volunteer my time organizing fundraising events, but had allowed myself to believe I was unqualified for paid professional work in the same sector. I met my mother for an early dinner at a restaurant in her Queens neighborhood, making the subway journey that I rarely took anymore now that my life centered on Manhattan and car services. My mother looked tired when she arrived, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her shift at the hospital. She was 58 years old but looked older, the cumulative effect of decades of hard work and worry visible in the lines around her eyes and the weariness in her movements. "You look beautiful as always," she said, embracing me with the fierce affection she had always shown her children. "That husband of yours is treating you well?" The question was casual, the kind of small talk that mothers made, but it struck something tender inside me. I wanted to tell her the truth about my marriage, about the loneliness and dismissiveness and the slow erosion of my sense of self. But I knew what she would say. She would remind me of how fortunate I was, how many women struggled to provide for themselves and their families, how foolish it would be to leave financial security for uncertain independence. My mother had worked herself to exhaustion for decades to keep us fed and housed. She had sacrificed her own dreams and desires for her children's welfare. In her worldview, my complaints about emotional fulfillment in the context of material abundance would seem incomprehensible and ungrateful. "Everything is fine," I said, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Alexander is busy with a major funding round, but that is normal for him." We ordered food and talked about my younger siblings, both of whom were doing well in their respective careers. My brother Miguel worked as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company, earning a solid salary and finally able to help my mother with her mortgage payments. My sister Carla had recently been promoted to manager at the marketing firm, where she had been working since college graduation. They were both building stable, independent lives, achieving the upward mobility that my mother had worked so hard to make possible for us. "They are doing so well," my mother said with evident pride. "You should be proud too, Victoria. You helped raise them while I was working. They would not be where they are without your example." The comment landed with unexpected weight. I had helped raise my siblings, taking on adult responsibilities as a teenager to support my mother's exhausted efforts to keep our family functioning. I had been capable and responsible and resourceful even as a young person navigating circumstances that many adults would have found overwhelming. When had I stopped believing in my own capabilities? When had I allowed someone else's assessment of my worth to replace my own understanding of what I could accomplish? "Mama," I said slowly, trying to find words for the question forming in my mind, "did you ever wish you had pursued something different? A different career or life path?" She considered the question while cutting her chicken, her expression thoughtful. "Of course I had dreams when I was young. I thought about becoming a doctor rather than a nurse, maybe specializing in pediatrics. But then I got pregnant with you and your father left and dreams became luxuries I could not afford. I had to focus on survival and on giving you children opportunities one never had." "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Regret?" She looked at me with surprise. "No, Victoria. My children are my greatest accomplishment. Everything I sacrificed was worth it to see you successful and happy. You especially. Look at you, married to a brilliant man, living a life I could not have imagined for myself. You have everything I worked for you to have." I nodded and changed the subject, unable to find words for the complicated emotions her answer generated. My mother had sacrificed her dreams for her children's welfare, and she viewed my marriage to Alexander as validation of those sacrifices. How could I explain that the life she saw as success felt like failure to me, that the material comfort she had worked so hard to provide for me felt like a gilded cage? She would not understand, or worse, she would understand and feel that I was rejecting the value of her sacrifices by failing to appreciate what they had made possible. We finished dinner and I rode the subway back to Manhattan, surrounded by people living their ordinary lives, heading home from work or going out for evening activities. I watched them and wondered about their stories, whether they felt trapped or free, satisfied or restless, whether they had learned the art of wanting what they had or maintained the courage to pursue what they wanted. The train emerged from the tunnel onto the Manhattan Bridge, and I looked out at the city skyline, lights beginning to illuminate buildings against the darkening sky. I thought about my mother's acceptance of limited choices, her reframing of sacrifice as accomplishment. There was nobility in what she had done, raising 3 children alone while working exhausting hours to keep us housed and fed. But there was also tragedy in how completely she had surrendered her own dreams and desires, how thoroughly she had absorbed the message that her own aspirations mattered less than her obligations to others. I had learned that lesson from her, learning to make myself small and secondary, to find identity in supporting others rather than building my own path. But I did not want to teach that lesson to anyone else, did not want my life to serve as an example of how women should sacrifice themselves for men's ambitions, and call that sacrifice love or partnership. If I ever had daughters, I wanted them to see a mother who had the courage to value herself, to build something meaningful independent of any relationship, to demonstrate that women could be whole people rather than supporting characters in someone else's story. Back at the penthouse, Alexander was in his study on a conference call with investors in Asia, his voice carrying that particular tone of persuasive confidence he used when explaining why people should give him money. I changed out of my dinner clothes and sat in the bedroom with my laptop, continuing the research I had begun that morning. I found an online certificate program in nonprofit management offered by a reputable university, designed specifically for working professionals seeking to update skills or transition into the sector. The program was self-paced and could be completed in 6 months with consistent effort. The cost was $1,500, a trivial amount in the context of our household finances, but significant enough that I would need to use my personal credit card rather than asking Alexander for money. I stared at the enrollment page for 20 minutes, cursor hovering over the submit button, paralyzed by the weight of what this small action represented. Enrolling in the program meant committing to a path that diverged from my current life trajectory. It meant acknowledging that I was serious about building professional capabilities independent of my role as Alexander's wife. It meant taking a concrete step toward a future that I could not yet fully envision, but knew had to be different from my present circumstances. I thought about Alexander's words from the previous night. You would be nothing without my name. I thought about my mother's proud assessment of my successful life as a wealthy man's wife. I thought about Jasmine's question about happiness and her reminder that I had agency even when it did not feel like it. And I thought about the woman I had been 7 years ago, ambitious and capable and full of plans for how she would contribute to making organizations more effective and communities stronger. I clicked the submit button before I could talk myself out of it. The system processed my payment and sent a confirmation email welcoming me to the program. I sat staring at the screen, heart racing as though I had just done something dangerous, rather than simply enrolling in an online course. But in the context of my marriage and the careful performance I had been maintaining, this was dangerous. This was the first concrete step toward building an identity and capabilities that did not depend on Alexander's name or resources. Over the following days, I settled into a new routine beneath the surface of my usual responsibilities. I woke at 5:30 as always, prepared Alexander's breakfast, managed household affairs, and fulfilled my social obligations. But in the margins of my schedule, I began working through the coursework for the certificate program, reading assigned materials about strategic planning and impact assessment, completing exercises about stakeholder engagement and resource development. The work was challenging after years away from structured learning, but it was also energizing in ways I had not anticipated. I felt my mind engaging with complex problems, making connections between concepts, developing analyses that went deeper than surface-level observation. I reconnected with a former colleague named Patricia Chun, who had worked at a different nonprofit when I was in the sector. Patricia had continued advancing in her career during the years I had been married, moving from program management to director of operations at a large education-focused organization. We met for coffee in Midtown, and I was honest with her about my situation in ways I had not been with most people. I walked away from my career when I got married, I told her. It seemed like the right choice at the time, but now I realize I made a mistake. I want to get back into nonprofit work, but I have no idea how to bridge the gap in my resume, or whether anyone would take me seriously after being out of the field for 6 years. Patricia listened without judgment, stirring sugar into her coffee while considering her response. The field has changed, but the fundamental challenges remain the same. Organizations still struggle with the same tensions between mission and operations, between passion and pragmatism. Your experience is dated but not irrelevant. What matters more is whether you can demonstrate current knowledge and commitment to rebuilding your professional capabilities. I enrolled in a certificate program, I said, and I am working to update my understanding of current practices and technologies, but I am not sure that will be enough to overcome the resume gap. It might not be enough for a senior position, Patricia acknowledged, but there are entry or mid-level positions where organizations would value your experience combined with demonstrated commitment to re-entry. You might need to accept a step back from where you were before marriage, but that does not mean starting completely over. And Victoria, 6 years is not an insurmountable gap. Women leave and re-enter the workforce all the time for various reasons. You just need to tell a coherent story about why you left and why you are returning. We talked for nearly 2 hours, with Patricia offering specific suggestions about organizations I should research, people I should try to connect with, and strategies for presenting my background in ways that would resonate with potential employers. She also shared honestly about her own career challenges, the discrimination she had faced as an Asian woman in leadership, the time she had questioned whether the struggle was worth the exhaustion. Her candor was both sobering and encouraging, acknowledging difficulty while also demonstrating that meaningful work was possible for women willing to persist through obstacles. "Can I ask you something personal?" Patricia said as we prepared to leave. "Are you planning to leave your marriage?" The question caught me off guard, though in retrospect it should not have. My interest in professional re-entry obviously signaled more than simple desire for intellectual stimulation. "I do not know," I admitted. "I am trying to build capabilities that would make independence possible if I decide I need it. But I have not made any definite decisions about my marriage." Patricia nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Just be careful, Victoria. Building professional capabilities takes time, and you might be more vulnerable during the transition period than you are right now. Make sure you understand what you would be walking away from and what resources you would have access to before you make any irreversible decisions." Her caution was practical and wise, but it also depressed me because it reinforced how trapped I was by financial dependence. I could not leave my marriage without professional capabilities that would support me, but I could not build those capabilities without time and effort that might be noticed and questioned by Alexander. I was caught in a circular problem where each potential solution created new complications. That evening, Alexander arrived home earlier than usual, near 8 rather than his typical midnight or later. He seemed energized rather than exhausted, which meant something positive had happened in his business dealings. I was in the living room working through a case study for my certificate program when he entered, and I quickly closed my laptop before he could ask what I was doing. "The Series D funding closed today," he announced, pouring himself a scotch from the bar cart. $40 million at a valuation of $3.2 billion. Chambers came through exactly as I predicted, and the other investors fell in line once he committed. "That is wonderful," I said, and meant it despite the complexity of my feelings about everything else. "Congratulations on the success." He sat in the chair across from me, loosening his tie and stretching his legs with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had achieved an important goal. "This puts us in position for international expansion next year. We can finally move aggressively into the Asian markets that have been resisting our entry. This is what I have been working toward for 5 years." I listened as he detailed his expansion plans, the markets he intended to target, the partnerships he would pursue, the competitors he would outmaneuver. His energy and passion for the work were evident, and I felt a familiar mixture of admiration and sadness. Alexander was brilliant at what he did, genuinely talented at building and scaling companies. That talent and drive were what had attracted me initially. That sense of being in the presence of someone who could envision possibilities and marshal resources to realize them. But that same intensity that made him effective in business made him incapable of the attention and presence that relationships required. "I have been thinking," he said after finishing his scotch and pouring another. "We should host a celebration dinner next month. Something significant to mark this milestone. Invite key investors and board members, maybe some press. You could organize it. You are good at those kinds of events. The request was casual, delivered as though he were asking me to handle a minor household task rather than plan a major business event. But it represented exactly the dynamic that had defined our marriage, Alexander generating demands and expectations, while I performed the labor necessary to fulfill them. And in that moment, something inside me refused to simply accept the assignment without question. I have enrolled in a certificate program, I said, the words emerging before I had consciously decided to share this information. In nonprofit management. I am working to update my professional skills. Alexander looked at me with confusion, as though I had suddenly started speaking a language he did not understand. Why would you do that? Because I want to return to professional work, I said, holding his gaze despite my racing heart. I miss using my skills in meaningful ways. I want to rebuild my career. He set down his glass with careful deliberation, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. We have discussed this before, Victoria. Your role is here, supporting me in managing our household. That is a full-time responsibility. It is not, I said quietly but firmly. The household largely runs itself with the staff we employ. Most of my time is spent waiting for you to need something or attending events that serve your business interests. I need more than that. You need more. He stood, pacing toward the windows. What you need is to recognize how fortunate your position is. Do you have any idea how many people would love to have your problems? No financial stress, complete freedom to pursue whatever interests you want, access to resources that most people never have. And you are complaining that you need more? I am not complaining, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. I am stating that I want to rebuild professional capabilities and return to work that feels meaningful to me. Fine, he said abruptly, turning back toward me. Take your certificate program. Volunteer more with your nonprofit contacts. Find whatever hobby will make you feel fulfilled. But do not pretend this is about meaningful work. You walked away from that world because you recognized you could have a better life with me. Do not romanticize what you left behind. The dismissiveness in his tone, the casual way he reduced my professional ambitions to hobbies and my desire for meaningful work to romantic delusion, crystallized something that had been forming in my understanding over the past week. Alexander did not simply fail to see me as an equal partner. He was incapable of seeing me that way. His entire self-concept was built around being the brilliant founder, the visionary leader, the person who created value while others supported or benefited from his efforts. There was no space in that worldview for a wife who wanted to be more than an accessory to his achievements. I am going to finish my certificate program, I said quietly, and then I am going to look for professional work. I am not asking your permission. I am informing you of my decision. He stared at me for several long seconds, something dangerous flickering in his expression. Then he laughed, sharp and dismissive. Professional work doing what, exactly? You have been out of the field for 6 years, Victoria. You have no current skills, no network, no credibility. What nonprofit is going to hire someone with your profile when they can recruit younger people with continuous experience who will work for modest salaries because they are passionate about the mission? His words were calculated to hurt, designed to reinforce the insecurity I had been fighting all week. And they succeeded in causing pain, striking at every doubt I had been wrestling with about my own capabilities and marketability. But they also accomplished something he had not intended. They revealed how clearly he had thought about these exact obstacles to my independence, which meant he had been aware all along that I was trapped by dependence he had encouraged and cultivated. Perhaps no organization will hire me, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice despite the emotion churning inside me. But I am going to try regardless. And if I fail, at least I will fail having tried rather than having accepted your assessment of my worthlessness without question. I never said you were worthless, he said, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as reassurance. I said you would be nothing without my name. There is a difference. You have value as my wife, Victoria. You add polish to my public presence. You manage our household effectively. You fulfill an important role. Why is that not enough for you? Because I am a person rather than a function, I thought but did not say aloud. Because I want to be valued for who I am rather than what I provide to you. because I deserve more than this. But I knew that explaining these things would accomplish nothing, except prolonging a conversation that was already causing more pain than it was worth. Alexander could not understand what I was trying to express because his entire framework for understanding relationships was transactional. People had value based on what they could provide or what purposes they could serve. Love and partnership, to the extent he conceived of them at all, were about alignment of interests and mutual benefit rather than about seeing and knowing and valuing another person independent of their utility. "I am going to bed," I said, standing and moving toward the bedroom. "Congratulations again on your funding success." I left him standing in the living room and closed the bedroom door behind me. I changed into pajamas and sat on the edge of the bed, shaking slightly from the confrontation. It had not gone well, but I had not expected it to. The important thing was that I had declared my intention to pursue professional re-entry despite his objections. I had drawn a line, however modest, establishing that I had agency independent of his preferences. I lay in bed unable to sleep, replaying the conversation and Alexander's final question. "Why is that not enough for you?" And I realized that I did not have a simple answer that he would understand, because the answer required accepting premises he rejected. It was not enough because I needed to matter as more than a role in someone else's story. It was not enough because I deserved partnership rather than patronage. It was not enough because I had to build something of my own if I was going to maintain any sense of self-worth. Over the following weeks, I continued working through my certificate program, while maintaining the careful performance of my usual responsibilities. Alexander and I settled into a cold détente where we spoke when necessary, but avoided any substantive conversation about my professional plans or our relationship. He threw himself even deeper into his work, spending longer hours at the office and traveling frequently for meetings with international partners. I attended the events that required my presence and excused myself from those that did not. I also began working with a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, who specialized in helping people navigate major life transitions. I had been resistant to therapy during my marriage, viewing it as an admission of failure or weakness, but I recognized that I needed support for what I was contemplating. Dr. Kim did not tell me what to do or push me toward any particular decision. Instead, she asked questions that helped me clarify my own thinking and identify the fears and assumptions that had been keeping me trapped. "What would it mean to fail at rebuilding your career?" she asked during one session. "It would mean Alexander was right about me," I admitted. "That I am nothing without his name. That I have no value independent of my connection to him." "Is that true?" she asked. "No," I said, but heard the uncertainty in my own voice. "Then why do you believe your worth depends on professional success?" she pressed. "Cannot you have value as a person independent of either your marriage or your career?" The question rattled something fundamental in my thinking. I had been so focused on proving Alexander wrong about my professional capabilities that I had not questioned the underlying premise we both seemed to share. That my value as a person depended on external validation through either relationship or career success. What would it mean to value myself independent of either metric? What would it look like to build a life based on my own assessment of what mattered rather than on proving something to Alexander or to anyone else? These were not questions I could answer quickly or easily, but they shifted something in how I approached the challenge ahead. I was not trying to prove anything to Alexander. I was trying to discover who I could become if I freed myself from the constraints of his expectations and assessments. That was a fundamentally different project with different metrics for success. The certificate program continued demanding steady effort, pushing me to think rigorously about organizational challenges and strategic decision-making. I completed case studies analyzing nonprofit effectiveness, wrote papers about resource development strategies, and participated in online discussions with other students working through similar materials. The work stretched capabilities that had atrophied through disuse, and I felt myself growing stronger and more confident with each completed assignment. I also began reaching out to former colleagues beyond Patricia, slowly rebuilding a professional network that could eventually help me identify opportunities for re-entry. Most people responded warmly to my messages, expressing genuine pleasure at reconnecting and interest in supporting my professional goals. Some conversations were awkward as I explained the 6-year gap in my work history, but most people seemed to accept my explanation about having stepped away to support my husband's career, before recognizing I needed to rebuild my own professional identity. By the end of part 2, I had not yet taken any irreversible steps toward leaving my marriage or dramatically changing my life circumstances. But I had taken the crucial first steps toward building capabilities and connections that would make independence possible, whenever I decided I was ready to pursue it. I had enrolled in education that would update my skills. I had begun rebuilding professional relationships. I had declared my intentions to Alexander despite his opposition. And perhaps most importantly, I had started questioning the fundamental assumptions about worth and value that had kept me trapped in a relationship that diminished rather than honored who I was. The path ahead remained uncertain and frightening, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward, rather than simply maintaining position in someone else's orbit. That momentum, however modest, felt like hope. The certificate program reached its midpoint on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, 3 months after I had first enrolled. I sat at the kitchen counter working through a complex case study about organizational restructuring, while Alexander prepared for a trip to Singapore that would keep him away for 10 days. He moved through the penthouse with the focused efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed routine, checking his luggage, confirming details with his assistant via phone, and reviewing presentation materials on his tablet. His departure barely registered as an event anymore. Just another in an endless series of absences that had become the primary characteristic of our marriage. "The housekeeper has my itinerary if you need to reach me," he said, pulling on his suit jacket. "Though I will be in back-to-back meetings most of the time, so email is more reliable than phone calls." "I hope the meetings go well," I replied, not looking up from my laptop screen where I was analyzing a nonprofit's financial statements and identifying inefficiencies in their resource allocation. He paused near the door, and I felt his attention settle on me with the particular quality that meant he was about to say something he considered important. "Victoria, I have been thinking about our conversation from a few months ago, about your interest in returning to work." I saved my document and looked up, surprised that he was raising this topic. We had maintained careful avoidance of anything substantive since our confrontation, conducting our interactions with the surface-level courtesy of distant acquaintances rather than married partners. "I spoke with the head of our corporate foundation," he continued. "She mentioned they could use volunteers to help with grant evaluation and program assessment. It would give you something meaningful to do without the complications of formal employment. I thought you might be interested." The offer was presented as a generous gesture, Alexander solving a problem I had raised by providing an acceptable solution within parameters he controlled. But I heard clearly what he was actually proposing. I could volunteer for his company's foundation, doing work that would reflect well on him while keeping me safely within his sphere of influence. I would remain Mrs. Alexander Chan, dutiful wife who supported her husband's philanthropic initiatives, rather than Victoria Martinez, independent professional with her own career trajectory. "That is thoughtful of you," I said carefully, "but I am looking for paid employment rather than volunteer work. I need to rebuild professional credentials that will support an independent career." His expression shifted, irritation flickering across features he usually kept carefully controlled. "You are being stubborn about this, Victoria. I am offering you a reasonable compromise that addresses your stated need for meaningful work without creating unnecessary complications in our lives." "What complications does my employment create for you?" I asked, genuine curiosity mixing with rising anger. "Practical complications," he said, his tone sharpening. "Your schedule would no longer be flexible to accommodate my needs. You would be tired from your own work rather than available to support mine. You would have conflicting loyalties between your employer and our household. These are not trivial concerns. These are the normal realities that millions of dual-career couples navigate successfully," I countered. "You are describing complications only because you have structured our marriage around the assumption that my time and energy belong entirely to you. I have structured our marriage around a division of labor that allows me to focus on building something significant," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You agreed to that structure when you married me. You understood what you were signing up for." "I understood that I was marrying a partner," I said, standing to face him directly rather than remaining seated like a subordinate receiving instructions. "I did not understand that I was signing a contract to subordinate my entire identity to supporting your ambitions while abandoning my own." "Your ambitions," he repeated, and something cruel entered his expression. You keep using that word, but what exactly are your ambitions, Victoria? To go back to making $30,000 a year coordinating charity events? To work 80-hour weeks for nonprofits that can barely afford to pay their staff? To sacrifice the comfortable life I have provided, so you can feel like you are making a difference in the world? My ambitions are none of your concern, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice, because I am no longer asking for your approval or input. I am informing you that I am completing this certificate program, and then I am pursuing professional employment, and you can either accept that reality or not. But your acceptance is not required for me to proceed. We stood facing each other across the kitchen, and I watched something calculating enter his expression. He was assessing the situation, determining how serious a threat I represented to the comfortable arrangement he had established, deciding how much resistance was warranted. If you pursue this, he said slowly, you should understand the implications. I will not adjust my schedule or expectations to accommodate your employment. I will not reduce my travel or my work hours to share household management responsibilities. I will not pretend that your salary, whatever modest amount you manage to earn, contributes meaningfully to our financial situation. You will be creating hardship for yourself without any corresponding benefit, and when you inevitably realize that this experiment in independence is not worth the cost, do not expect sympathy from me. I would never expect sympathy from you, I replied quietly. I stopped expecting anything from you a long time ago. The statement landed with visible impact. Alexander's expression closed down, that particular shutdown that happened when his carefully constructed self-image encountered information that contradicted it. He picked up his luggage without another word and left the penthouse, the door closing behind him with decisive finality. I stood motionless in the kitchen for several minutes after his departure, adrenaline flooding my system in the aftermath of confrontation. My hands were shaking slightly, and I felt simultaneously energized and terrified by what had just occurred. I had drawn a line more clearly than ever before, stating explicitly that I intended to rebuild my career regardless of his objections. There would be consequences for that declaration, though I did not yet know what form those consequences would take. But beneath the fear, I felt something else emerging. A kind of clarity that came from finally speaking truth that had been building inside me for months. I had stopped pretending that our marriage was something it was not. I had stopped performing gratitude for a life that felt like imprisonment. I had claimed the right to pursue my own goals independent of his approval. These were small victories in the context of everything that still needed to change, but they represented fundamental shifts in how I understood my own agency. I returned to my case study with renewed focus, channeling the emotional intensity of the confrontation into productive work. The case involved a nonprofit that had grown rapidly without developing adequate operational infrastructure, resulting in mission drift and declining effectiveness. I analyzed their organizational structure, identified key weaknesses in their governance and resource allocation, and developed recommendations for restructuring that would support sustainable growth while maintaining mission focus. The work required integrating multiple frameworks and synthesizing complex information, and I felt genuine satisfaction when I submitted the completed assignment. Over the following days, with Alexander away in Singapore, I accelerated my professional preparation. I completed the remaining modules of my certificate program ahead of schedule, driven by urgency that had crystallized during our final confrontation. I updated my resume, carefully framing the 6-year gap in my employment history as a period when I had stepped away to support family obligations before recognizing the importance of maintaining professional engagement. I drafted cover letters that acknowledged the gap honestly while emphasizing my commitment to re-entering the field and my recent efforts to update relevant skills. I also scheduled informational interviews with 3 nonprofit executives that Patricia had connected me with, framing these conversations as opportunities to learn about current trends in the sector, rather than as direct job solicitation. The interviews were both encouraging and sobering. The executives all acknowledged that my background and newly updated skills made me a potentially valuable candidate, but they were also honest about the challenges I would face competing against candidates with continuous career progression and current experience. The gap itself is not insurmountable, one executive told me during our conversation at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. But you need to be strategic about how you position yourself. You should probably target operations or program management roles, rather than senior leadership positions initially. Focus on organizations that value your particular combination of skills and experience. And be prepared to accept a compensation level that reflects your current market position, rather than what you might have commanded if you had remained in the field continuously. The advice was practical and somewhat discouraging. I would need to accept a significant step back from where my career trajectory had been heading before marriage, probably earning a salary that would feel modest compared to the lifestyle I had become accustomed to. But the alternative was remaining trapped in dependence on Alexander, and that was no longer acceptable regardless of the financial cost. I also made an appointment with a divorce attorney that Patricia had recommended, framing the meeting as exploratory rather than as immediate preparation for filing. The attorney, a woman named Jennifer Zhao who specialized in high-net-worth divorces, listened carefully as I explained my situation, and then provided a sobering assessment of what I could expect if I chose to end my marriage. New York is an equitable distribution state, she explained, which means marital assets are divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. The court considers multiple factors including the length of the marriage, each spouse's contribution to marital assets, and each spouse's economic circumstances. In your case, you have been married for 6 years, which is not a particularly long duration. Your husband built his company before the marriage, so the business itself would likely be considered separate property rather than marital property. However, any increase in the company's value during the marriage could potentially be considered marital property subject to division. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means you would be entitled to a portion of the increase in Chen Technologies' value from the date of your marriage to the date of divorce filing, Jennifer said. But calculating that increase and arguing for your entitlement to it would be complex and contentious. Your husband's attorneys would argue that the company's growth resulted entirely from his efforts and decisions, and that your contributions as a spouse were minimal and did not directly contribute to the business success. You would need to establish that your role in managing the household and supporting his work freed him to focus on the company, which indirectly contributed to its success. And if I could establish that? I asked. Then you might be entitled to somewhere between 20 and 40% of the marital increase in the company's value, depending on various factors and how effectively your legal team argues your case. But Victoria, you should understand that this would be an expensive and protracted battle. Your husband has substantial resources to fund aggressive legal representation, and high-net-worth divorces typically take years to resolve when one party contests the asset division. You would need significant resources of your own to sustain that kind of litigation. The reality she described was daunting. Leaving my marriage would mean entering an expensive legal battle that could stretch for years, during which I would need to support myself on whatever modest salary I could earn while paying legal fees that would quickly consume any savings I had. Alexander could afford to draw out the proceedings indefinitely, using his superior resources to pressure me into accepting an unfavorable settlement. What would you advise? I asked. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, considering her response carefully. If you decide to leave, you should do so from a position of strength rather than desperation. That means establishing independent income first, building up some financial reserves, and documenting everything related to your contributions to the marriage and household management. It also means being realistic about what you are walking away from. Your lifestyle will change dramatically, and the settlement you eventually receive, whenever that occurs, may not compensate for the immediate financial loss you will experience. But it is possible to leave? I pressed. I would not be trapped permanently because of the financial disparity. It is always possible to leave, Jennifer said firmly. The question is what cost you are willing to accept for your independence, and whether that cost is worth it to you. Only you can answer that question. I left her office with a clearer understanding of the practical realities I would face if I chose to end my marriage. The path forward would be difficult and expensive and uncertain, but the path forward was at least visible now, no longer obscured by my own ignorance about legal processes and financial implications. I had information, and information created options even when those options were all challenging. That evening, I sat in the empty penthouse and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would complete my certificate program, secure employment in the nonprofit sector, and establish financial independence before filing for divorce. This meant continuing to live with Alexander and maintain at least a surface-level appearance of marriage for however many months it took to build professional stability. It meant enduring his dismissiveness and the emotional emptiness of our relationship while working toward eventual freedom. It meant accepting that liberation would be a process rather than a single dramatic action. But it also meant I had a plan, concrete steps I could take that would eventually lead to independence. I would no longer be simply reacting to Alexander's demands or drifting through a life someone else had designed. I would be actively building toward a future I had chosen, even if that future remained months or years away from realization. I opened a new document on my laptop and began drafting a detailed plan with specific milestones and timelines. Complete the certificate program by the end of the month. Begin actively applying for positions in January. Accept the best available offer even if it requires accepting a lower salary than I preferred. Work for at least 6 months to establish employment stability and build some financial reserves. Consult with Jennifer again to finalize divorce strategy. File for divorce from a position of demonstrated independence rather than desperate escape. The timeline stretched across at least 8 months, possibly longer depending on how quickly I could secure employment. 8 months of continuing to live with Alexander, of maintaining the performance of marriage while knowing it was ending, of keeping my plans secret while working steadily toward their realization. The prospect was exhausting and depressing, but it was also manageable. I could endure 8 months of difficulty if I knew it was leading somewhere rather than simply perpetuating an unsustainable situation indefinitely. Alexander returned from Singapore on a Friday evening, arriving near midnight after a delayed flight. I was still awake, working on the final project for my certificate program, when I heard his key in the lock. He entered quietly, clearly exhausted from travel and the intense schedule he had maintained throughout the trip. He dropped his luggage in the entryway and moved toward the bedroom without speaking to me. "How were your meetings?" I asked, more from habit than genuine curiosity. "Productive," he replied without turning around. "We secured partnership agreements with 2 major distributors in Southeast Asian markets. The international expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule." "That is good news," I said. He paused in the bedroom doorway and looked back at me, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting. "Have you been thinking about what I said before I left? About the foundation volunteer position?" "I have been thinking about my own plans for professional re-entry," I replied carefully. "I appreciate the offer, but I remain committed to pursuing independent employment." He nodded slowly, something resigned in the gesture. "Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss about it. Do what you feel you need to do, Victoria. Just do not expect me to celebrate your choices or adjust my life to accommodate them." "I do not expect anything from you," I said, and meant it with a completeness that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "I stopped expecting anything from you when I realized you were incapable of seeing me as anything other than an accessory to your ambitions." He flinched slightly at the statement but did not respond, simply turning and disappearing into the bedroom. I heard the shower start a few minutes later and returned my attention to my work, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret about the exchange. We had reached a kind of honest detachment where we no longer pretended to be something we were not, and that honesty, however painful, felt preferable to the performance we had been maintaining. I completed my certificate program the following week, submitting my final project and receiving notification that I had earned the credential with distinction. The accomplishment felt significant beyond the certificate itself. I had proven to myself that I could complete challenging academic work despite years away from structured learning. I had updated my knowledge of current nonprofit management practices and frameworks. I had demonstrated commitment and follow-through on a goal I had set independent of anyone else's expectations or approval. I added the certificate to my resume and LinkedIn profile, framing it as evidence of my commitment to professional re-entry and my investment in maintaining current knowledge. I also wrote a brief narrative statement explaining my career gap, acknowledging that I had stepped away from professional work to support family obligations before recognizing the importance of maintaining my own career identity and professional engagement. The statement was honest without being overly personal, acknowledging reality while framing my re-entry in positive terms. Then I began the grinding work of job applications. I identified 20 nonprofit organizations whose missions aligned with my interests and values, ranging from small local organizations to large national entities. I researched each organization thoroughly, customizing my cover letter to demonstrate genuine knowledge of their work and specific understanding of how my skills could contribute to their goals. I emphasized my operational capabilities, my strategic thinking, and my ability to bridge mission and management in ways that strengthen organizational effectiveness. The first round of applications yielded mostly silence or polite rejections. Organizations thanked me for my interest, but indicated they had selected other candidates whose qualifications more closely matched their needs. Each rejection stung despite my attempts to maintain emotional detachment, reinforcing my fears that I had waited too long, that the gap was too large, that Alexander had been right about my worthlessness in the professional marketplace. But I persisted, continuing to submit applications while also expanding my networking efforts. I attended nonprofit sector events and conferences, introducing myself to people and being honest about my situation. I reached out to former colleagues and professors, asking for advice and connections rather than direct job referrals. I volunteered for a small local organization, doing program evaluation work that would give me recent experience to reference in interviews. 6 weeks into my job search, I received an email requesting an interview for a program manager position at an education-focused nonprofit called Future Scholars Initiative. The organization worked with low-income high school students, providing college preparation support and mentorship. The position involved overseeing multiple program sites, managing a small team of coordinators, and ensuring program quality and consistency across locations. The salary was $55,000, a fraction of what Alexander earned but enough to live on if I managed carefully. I prepared for the interview with intense focus, researching the organization exhaustively and developing thoughtful responses to anticipated questions about my background and the gap in my employment history. When the interview day arrived, I took the subway to their offices in the Bronx, deliberately choosing public transportation over a car service to begin adjusting to the financial realities of independent life. The interview panel consisted of the executive director, a woman named Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, and the director of programs, a man named James Park. They were both warm and professional, asking substantive questions about my approach to program management and my understanding of the challenges facing low-income students navigating college preparation. I was honest about my career gap, explaining that I had stepped away to support my husband's demanding career before recognizing that I needed to maintain my own professional identity. I acknowledged that my skills were somewhat dated, but emphasized my recent certificate program and my commitment to bringing both passion and operational rigor to nonprofit work. Why do you want to work in education specifically? Dr. Rodriguez asked toward the end of the interview. Your background is primarily in general nonprofit management, rather than education-focused work. I considered the question carefully before responding. I was the first person in my family to attend college, I said. My mother worked as a nurse, raising 3 children alone, and she sacrificed enormously to make education possible for us. I understand viscerally what it means to navigate higher education without family knowledge or resources to guide you. I also understand how crucial organizational systems and support structures are in helping students succeed despite those challenges. This work matters to me personally, not just professionally. Something shifted in Dr. Rodriguez's expression, a kind of recognition that suggested my answer had resonated. The interview concluded shortly after, with both interviewers thanking me warmly and indicating they would make a decision within 2 weeks. I rode the subway back to Manhattan feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified. The position was perfect for re-entering the field, challenging enough to rebuild my professional credibility without being so senior that my candidacy seemed implausible. The organization's mission aligned perfectly with my values and personal background, but I had no idea whether they would actually offer me the position, or whether I was simply one of many qualified candidates they were considering. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning while Alexander was on yet another business trip, I received a phone call from Dr. Rodriguez offering me the program manager position at Future Scholars Initiative. The salary was as discussed, the start date would be in 1 month, and they were excited to have me join their team. I accepted the offer immediately, feeling a rush of relief and vindication that brought tears to my eyes. I had done it. Despite the 6-year gap, despite Alexander's dismissiveness, despite my own fears and doubts, I had secured professional employment that would allow me to begin building financial independence. The salary was modest compared to the lifestyle I had become accustomed to, but it was mine, earned through my own capabilities rather than granted through my connection to Alexander. I called Jasmine immediately to share the news, and she screamed with excitement on the other end of the line. "Victoria, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you. When do you start?" "For weeks," I said, still processing the reality of what had just happened. "I need to give notice to Alexander, though I am not sure that applies since I have not been formally employed. I just need to inform him that my schedule is about to change dramatically." "How do you think he will react?" Jasmine asked, concern entering her voice. "Badly," I admitted. "But it does not matter anymore. I have made my decision, and I have the employment offer to back it up. He can be angry or dismissive or whatever he wants to be. It will not change the fact that I am doing this." That evening, when Alexander returned from his meetings, I told him about the job offer over dinner that I had prepared specifically for the purpose of having this conversation. He listened without interrupting as I explained the position, the organization, and the start date. His expression remained neutral throughout my explanation, giving me no indication of his reaction. $55,000, he said finally. "That is what you are walking away from this life for? A salary that would barely cover the monthly maintenance on this penthouse?" "I am not walking away from anything yet," I replied carefully. "I am accepting employment that will allow me to rebuild my professional capabilities and establish independence. What I do with that independence in the future remains to be seen." "You are establishing independence so you can leave me," he said flatly. "Let us not pretend this is about anything else. This is about rebuilding my sense of self," I countered. "Whether that ultimately leads to leaving our marriage depends on whether our marriage can evolve to accommodate two independent people, rather than one successful person and one subordinate supporter." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I will not beg you to stay, Victoria. If you want to throw away everything I have provided to chase some fantasy of professional fulfillment, that is your choice. But do not expect me to applaud your decision or support this delusion that you are going to find more meaning coordinating programs for teenagers than you have being my wife. I do not need you to applaud or support anything," I said, remaining seated and keeping my voice level. "I only need you to understand that I am doing this regardless of your opinion about it." He left the room without another word, and I heard his study door close with decisive force. I sat alone at the dining table, feeling the weight of what I had just set in motion. In 4 weeks, I would begin working full-time at Future Scholars Initiative. My schedule would no longer revolve around Alexander's needs and demands. I would have colleagues and responsibilities and challenges that had nothing to do with supporting his empire. I would be earning my own money and building my own professional reputation. Most importantly, I would be taking the first concrete step toward a life where I mattered as a person rather than as an accessory. The path ahead remained uncertain and difficult, but I was finally walking it rather than simply imagining it from the safety of my comfortable cage. The decision had been made. The first real step had been taken. There was no going back now, only forward into whatever future I would build for myself. The first morning of my employment at Future Scholars Initiative arrived with the sharp clarity of a threshold being crossed. I woke at 5:30 as always, but instead of preparing breakfast for Alexander and organizing his schedule, I dressed in professional attire appropriate for an office environment rather than the designer clothing I wore to accompany him to business events. The navy suit I selected from the back of my closet had not been worn in 6 years, purchased during my previous professional life, and preserved through multiple closet reorganizations like a relic from another existence. It fit differently now, tighter in some places and looser in others, a physical reminder of how much time had passed since I had last needed clothing for actual work, rather than ornamental purposes. Alexander had already left for an early meeting by the time I emerged from the bedroom, which spared us the awkwardness of acknowledging this significant transition. We had barely spoken in the 4 weeks since I accepted the position, maintaining a cold civility that allowed us to coexist in the same space without engaging in meaningful conversation. He had made his disapproval clear through pointed silences and occasional cutting remarks about my impending employment, but he had not actively tried to prevent me from starting the position. I suspected this reflected calculation rather than acceptance. A recognition that overt opposition would only strengthen my resolve while accomplishing nothing except creating additional conflict. I took the subway to the Bronx during morning rush hour, surrounded by people heading to their own jobs with the weary determination that characterized working life in New York City. The experience felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, reconnecting me with a version of myself that had navigated this same transit system daily before marriage elevated me to a life of car services and private transportation. I stood holding the pole as the train lurched through tunnels, watching the mix of humanity around me, and feeling a strange sense of homecoming despite the discomfort and crowding. The Future Scholars Initiative offices occupied the third floor of a building near Fordham Road, accessible through a lobby that showed its age but remained clean and functional. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I had always done at my previous nonprofit positions, and found the main entrance locked. A security guard eventually appeared to let me in, directing me to the elevator and informing me that most staff arrived closer to 9 rather than the 8:45 start time I had been given. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez greeted me warmly when I reached the third floor, appearing from her office with coffee in hand and genuine enthusiasm in her expression. She was in her early 50s, with the kind of commanding presence that came from years of leading organizations through challenging circumstances, while maintaining unwavering commitment to mission. I had learned during the interview process that she had built Future Scholars Initiative from a small pilot program, serving 30 students to a comprehensive organization, now supporting over 800 young people across 5 program sites in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. "Welcome to your first day," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "I am so pleased you are joining our team. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I think you are going to find it meaningful and challenging in the best possible ways." She gave me a tour of the office space, introducing me to staff members as we encountered them. The program coordinators who would report to me were already at their desks, 3 women in their late 20s and early 30s who greeted me with cautious friendliness. I recognized the dynamic immediately from my previous nonprofit experience. They were assessing whether I would be a supportive manager who empowered their work or a bureaucratic obstacle who created additional burdens without adding value. I would need to earn their trust and respect through demonstrated competence and genuine support for their efforts. James Park, the director of programs who would serve as my direct supervisor, met with me mid-morning to review my initial priorities and responsibilities. He was methodical and detail-oriented, walking me through organizational systems, program structures, and the specific challenges facing each of the 5 sites I would be overseeing. The organization had grown rapidly in recent years, which created both opportunities and complications. Program quality varied significantly across sites, data collection was inconsistent, and coordination between sites was minimal despite the fact that they were all ostensibly implementing the same program model. Your primary focus for the first 90 days should be understanding the current state of operations at each site, James explained, pulling up spreadsheets that showed student enrollment, attendance rates, and outcome metrics. Once you have a clear picture of what is actually happening versus what is supposed to be happening, we can work together to develop improvement plans that address the quality and consistency issues. I spent the remainder of my first day reviewing program documentation, examining data reports, and beginning to map the organizational landscape I would be navigating. The work was simultaneously overwhelming and energizing. There was so much to learn, so many moving pieces to understand, so many relationships to build with coordinators and site staff. But I felt my mind engaging with substantive challenges in ways it had not in years, analyzing problems and beginning to formulate hypotheses about root causes and potential solutions. I arrived home near 7 that evening, exhausted in a way that felt completely different from the fatigue I experienced managing Alexander's household and schedule. This was the tiredness that came from intellectual engagement and meaningful work, from spending hours focused on problems that mattered and contributing to outcomes that would affect real students navigating real challenges. I felt simultaneously drained and alive in ways I had nearly forgotten were possible. Alexander was in his study on a conference call when I entered the penthouse. I changed out of my work clothes, prepared a simple dinner for myself, and sat at the kitchen counter reviewing notes I had taken throughout the day. I was creating a systematic framework for assessing each program site, identifying key questions I needed to answer and information I needed to gather to understand operational realities. The framework would guide my site visits over the coming weeks, and ensure I approach the assessment consistently across all locations. Alexander emerged from his study near 9, pouring himself a scotch and leaning against the kitchen counter to observe me working. His expression was unreadable, some mixture of curiosity and disapproval that I had learned to recognize over years of marriage. "How was your first day changing the world?" he asked, and the sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable. "It was good," I replied evenly, refusing to be baited into defensiveness. "The organization has grown rapidly and needs stronger operational systems. There is meaningful work to be done." "At $55,000 a year," he added. "Have you calculated what you are earning per hour after accounting for commute time and work beyond standard hours? I suspect it comes out to less than we pay our housekeeper." "I am not doing this for the money," I said, keeping my attention on my notes rather than looking at him. "I am doing it to rebuild professional capabilities and contribute to work that matters." "Work that matters," he repeated, and something genuinely angry entered his voice. "You say that as though what I do does not matter. As though building technology that improves efficiency for thousands of companies and creates jobs for thousands of people is somehow less meaningful than tutoring teenagers." I looked up from my notes, considering whether to engage with this challenge or simply let it pass. But something in his tone suggested this was about more than our usual conflict about my employment. There was a vulnerability beneath the anger, a need for validation that I rarely heard from him. "What you do matters," I said carefully. "You have built something genuinely impressive, Alexander. I have never disputed that. But what you do mattering does not require that what I do is meaningless. There is space in the world for multiple kinds of valuable contribution." He studied me for a long moment, his expression shifting through emotions I could not quite read. Then he finished his scotch in a single swallow and set the glass down with deliberate care. "I hope this experiment brings you whatever fulfillment you are seeking," he said finally. "But do not come to me in 6 months complaining about how exhausting it is or how little you are being paid. You made this choice despite my advice, and you will have to live with the consequences." He returned to his study without waiting for a response, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my notes and my thoughts. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions that I did not have energy to fully process. Relief that he was not actively sabotaging my employment. Sadness that he could not understand why this mattered to me. Anger at his dismissiveness and his need to frame my professional pursuits as naive delusions rather than legitimate aspirations. And underneath everything, a growing clarity that our marriage was not sustainable regardless of whether I was employed or not. The following weeks established a new rhythm in my life, one that felt simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. I woke early to prepare for work, commuted to the Bronx on crowded subway trains, spent long days visiting program sites and meeting with coordinators, and returned home in the evenings to continue processing information and developing frameworks for improving program quality. The work was demanding in ways I had not anticipated, requiring me to rapidly rebuild skills that had atrophied through disuse, while also learning new approaches and technologies that had emerged during my absence from the field. I visited each of the 5 program sites multiple times during my first month, observing program sessions, interviewing students and staff, and examining operational systems and data collection practices. The disparities between sites were even more significant than the aggregate data had suggested. The strongest site, located in a community center in the South Bronx, had an exceptional coordinator who had developed robust systems for tracking student progress, maintaining consistent communication with families, and adapting curriculum to meet individual student needs. The weakest site, operating out of a high school building in Upper Manhattan, struggled with basic operational functions, had minimal documentation of student interactions, and appeared to be delivering programming that bore little resemblance to the intended program model. I documented my observations systematically, taking detailed notes during each site visit, and organizing the information into consistent categories that would allow for meaningful comparison. I was essentially conducting an organizational audit without calling it that, gathering the evidence base necessary to make informed recommendations about how to improve program quality and consistency. The work drew on skills I had developed during my previous nonprofit career, while also pushing me to think more rigorously about systems design and quality assurance than I had needed to in my earlier positions. James proved to be an excellent supervisor, providing clear guidance about organizational priorities, while also giving me substantial autonomy to approach my work in ways that made sense to me. He reviewed my site visit notes and assessment framework with evident appreciation for the thoroughness of my approach, and he began involving me in broader organizational conversations about strategic planning and resource allocation. I felt myself growing into the role more quickly than I had anticipated, my confidence rebuilding as I demonstrated competence and received positive feedback from leadership. The program coordinators I supervised represented my most significant challenge during this early period. They were all committed to the students they served and worked long hours with minimal resources, but their approaches varied dramatically, and some were resistant to the increased structure and accountability I was working to implement. The coordinator at the weakest site, a woman named Jennifer Morrison who had been with the organization for 3 years, was particularly defensive when I began asking detailed questions about her program operations and data collection practices. "I am focused on building relationships with students," she told me during one particularly tense conversation at her site. "I do not have time to fill out extensive paperwork documenting every interaction. The students need support and mentorship, not bureaucratic systems that take me away from actually working with them." I understood her frustration because I had heard similar complaints throughout my previous nonprofit career. Many people entered the social services sector because they cared deeply about direct service work and found administrative tasks draining and irrelevant. But I also understood from experience that without adequate systems and documentation, organizations could not demonstrate impact, could not identify what was working and what needed improvement, and could not make informed decisions about resource allocation. "I appreciate your commitment to relationship building," I replied, keeping my tone supportive rather than critical. "But part of serving students well is being able to track their progress over time, identify students who need additional support, and demonstrate to funders that our programs are achieving intended outcomes. The documentation I am asking for should take no more than 15 minutes per week per student, and it will make you more effective at supporting them rather than less." She remained skeptical but agreed to implement the documentation systems I had designed. I knew that changing her practices would require ongoing support and follow-up rather than a single conversation, so I scheduled regular check-ins with her to review her documentation and provide feedback. I also made a point of acknowledging the strengths I observed in her work, particularly her genuine care for students and her creativity in engaging young people who were struggling academically. Building relationships with my coordinators required a delicate balance between establishing my authority as their supervisor and respecting their expertise about the specific communities and students they served. I was conscious that I was new to the organization and to education-focused nonprofit work, which meant I needed to demonstrate competence without pretending to know more than I did about their particular contexts. I asked questions constantly, acknowledged when I did not know things, and made clear that I viewed my role as supporting and strengthening their work, rather than criticizing or micromanaging them. During my second month at Future Scholars Initiative, I developed a comprehensive assessment report that synthesized my findings from the site visits and outlined recommendations for improving program quality and consistency. The report identified specific operational weaknesses at each site, analyzed patterns across the organization, and proposed concrete interventions including enhanced coordinator training, revised data collection systems, and clearer program guidelines that balance fidelity to the core model with appropriate flexibility for site-specific adaptation. I presented the report to Dr. Rodriguez and James during a meeting in early December, walking them through my findings and recommendations with the kind of detailed analysis I had not had opportunity to produce in years. They asked probing questions about my reasoning and the feasibility of various recommendations, and I felt myself rising to the challenge of defending my analysis and adapting suggestions based on their feedback. "This is exactly the kind of rigorous assessment we needed," Dr. Rodriguez said after I concluded my presentation. "You have clearly identified both our strengths and our weaknesses, and your recommendations are specific enough to be actionable, while still being realistic, given our resource constraints. I want you to take the lead on implementing these improvements over the next 6 months." The affirmation felt disproportionately meaningful, validating months of work to rebuild professional capabilities and prove that I could contribute substantively to organizational effectiveness. I had not realized how much I had internalized Alexander's dismissiveness about my professional value until I experienced this recognition from leaders I respected. Their confidence in my capabilities reminded me that I was actually good at this work, that my skills had real value in the marketplace, that Alexander's assessment of me as nothing without his name was fundamentally wrong. I also began developing genuine friendships with colleagues at Future Scholars Initiative, something I had not experienced since before my marriage. My fellow program manager, a woman named Lisa Chun who oversaw college transition support services, became a regular lunch companion. She was sharp and funny and deeply committed to the students we served, and she shared candidly about her own career journey, including mistakes she had made and lessons she had learned. Our conversations ranged from strategic discussions about organizational challenges to personal exchanges about relationships and family dynamics. "Your husband is Alexander Chun?" she asked during one lunch after I mentioned something about his work in passing. "The tech billionaire?" "Yes," I confirmed, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the disparity between my professional salary and my personal circumstances. "And you are working here for $55,000 a year?" She studied me with open curiosity. "That is either the most principled choice I have ever heard of, or the most dramatic middle finger to your marriage that anyone has ever executed." I laughed despite myself, appreciating her directness. Probably some combination of both. I needed to rebuild professional identity separate from my husband's success. This position allows me to do meaningful work while establishing financial independence. "Are you leaving him?" she asked, and there was no judgment in the question, just genuine interest. "Eventually," I admitted, surprising myself with how readily the acknowledgement came. "I am building toward independence so that when I leave, I am doing so from strength rather than desperation." Lisa nodded slowly, respect evident in her expression. "That is strategic and brave. Most people stay trapped in unhappy marriages because they cannot envision supporting themselves. You are doing the hard work of making independence possible." Her understanding and support meant more than I could adequately express. I had been so isolated during my marriage, performing happiness while dying inside, unable to be honest with most people about the reality of my circumstances. Having a colleague who knew the truth and responded with respect rather than judgment felt like a form of liberation. I also discovered unexpected mentorship from Dr. Rodriguez, who seemed to recognize something of herself in my situation even though I had not shared extensive personal details with her. She had built Future Scholars Initiative while raising 3 children as a single mother after her husband died when she was in her 30s. And she spoke openly about the challenges of combining professional ambition with personal responsibilities and limited resources. "The nonprofit sector can be brutal for women," she told me during one of our regular check-in meetings. "We are expected to be endlessly devoted to mission, while accepting minimal compensation and making endless personal sacrifices. But you have to establish boundaries and maintain your sense of self-worth, or the work will consume you without giving back what you need to sustain yourself." Her advice felt particularly relevant given my tendency to lose myself in supporting others, whether that meant subordinating my identity to Alexander's ambitions or pouring all my energy into my students without maintaining adequate reserves for my own well-being. I began experimenting with setting clearer boundaries around my work hours and being more intentional about how I allocated my time and energy. By late December, 3 months into my employment at Future Scholars Initiative, I had established myself as a capable and valued member of the leadership team. My coordinators were implementing the improved systems I had designed, and we were already seeing better data quality and more consistent program delivery across sites. I had contributed meaningfully to organizational strategic planning discussions, and had begun developing new program assessment frameworks that could be applied across the organization. I was earning my salary and proving my professional worth through demonstrated results, rather than just through credentials or potential. The financial realities of independence were also becoming clearer during this period. I had opened a separate bank account where I deposited my paychecks, keeping these funds completely separate from the joint accounts I shared with Alexander. After taxes and deductions, my take-home pay was approximately $3,800 per month. I began researching apartment costs in neighborhoods I could potentially afford, and the numbers were sobering. Even modest one-bedroom apartments in safer areas of the outer boroughs cost $1,800 to $2,200 per month, consuming more than half my net income before accounting for any other expenses. I met with Jennifer Zhao again to discuss financial planning for divorce, and she helped me develop a realistic budget for independent living. After accounting for rent, utilities, food, transportation, and other basic expenses, I would have minimal cushion for unexpected costs or emergencies. I would need to live far more frugally than I had become accustomed to during my marriage, and I would need to build an emergency fund before I could reasonably leave given the financial instability that divorce proceedings would create. I recommend having at least 6 months of living expenses saved before you file for divorce, Jennifer advised. That gives you a buffer to handle unexpected costs and provides some security during what will likely be a contentious and expensive legal process. Based on your budget, that means saving approximately $15,000 before you initiate proceedings. At my current savings rate, setting aside $500 per month from my salary, building that emergency fund would take 30 months, 2.5 years. The timeline was discouraging, suggesting I would need to remain married to Alexander for at least that long before I could safely pursue divorce. But Jennifer suggested an alternative approach. You could accelerate the timeline by taking a larger cash distribution from your joint accounts before you file, she said. Legally, you have equal access to marital funds. If you withdrew $20,000 and deposited it in your separate account, you could file for divorce much sooner while having adequate reserves to sustain yourself through the proceedings. Your husband would likely argue during the divorce that you should not be entitled to additional assets because you already took that distribution, but the court would consider it as part of the overall asset division rather than as theft or misconduct. The suggestion made strategic sense but felt ethically complicated. Taking a large sum from our joint accounts without telling Alexander seemed deceptive, even though I had legal right to access those funds. But Jennifer reminded me that Alexander had substantially more resources and power in our relationship, and that I needed to approach divorce strategically rather than prioritizing fairness to someone who had not treated me fairly. He will use every advantage he has to pressure you into accepting an unfavorable settlement, she said bluntly. You need to protect yourself and ensure you have adequate resources to sustain an extended legal battle. Taking that distribution is not theft. It is ensuring you have the means to pursue a fair outcome. I left her office with much to consider, uncomfortable with some of the strategic calculations involved in protecting myself but also recognizing that my discomfort likely reflected years of conditioning to prioritize Alexander's interests over my own. I did not make any immediate decisions about taking a distribution from our joint accounts, but I began monitoring those accounts more carefully and considering when might be the right time to execute that strategy. My relationship with Alexander continued deteriorating throughout this period, our interactions becoming increasingly minimal and transactional. We barely spoke except when necessary to coordinate household logistics or schedule obligations. He made no effort to engage with my work or show any interest in what I was doing at Future Scholars Initiative. I stopped sharing details about my days, recognizing that he viewed my employment as a phase I was going through rather than as a serious professional commitment. The holidays were particularly tense, with both of us performing normalcy for our families while maintaining emotional distance from each other. Alexander's parents visited for Christmas dinner, and I played the role of gracious hostess while feeling like an actress in a play rather than a participant in my own life. My mother came for a separate meal, and I deflected her questions about why Alexander and I seemed distant by claiming we were both stressed from our respective work demands. As the calendar turned to a new year, I felt both exhausted and energized by the transformation I had been working toward. I had rebuilt professional capabilities that Alexander claimed I did not possess. I had established financial independence, however modest, that created options I had not had before. I had developed relationships and support systems outside my marriage that reminded me I had value beyond my connection to my husband. And I had proven to myself that I was capable of the courage and persistence required to pursue independence despite fear and uncertainty. The path forward remained challenging and unclear in many ways. But I was walking that path rather than remaining paralyzed by fear of the unknown. And with each step forward, I felt myself becoming more fully myself, reconnecting with the ambitious and capable woman I had been before marriage and discovering new dimensions of strength I had not known I possessed. The foundations were being built, slowly but steadily, for a life that would eventually be entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.